Exhumation Project, Madeleine Fullard, in the studio for a discussion. Good evening to you, and thank you for coming in to talk to us about this. I mean, just take us through this project. Obviously, today's exhumations are part of an ongoing project. There have been others with more to follow.
Yes. Well, the Missing Persons Task Team is mandated to search for those who disappeared in political circumstances between 1960 and 1994. And one of the groups that we look at are the political prisoners who were hanged. Because, of course, the families know that they were sentenced to death and they were executed, but the bodies have been missing for all these decades. Because after the political prisoners were executed, their bodies remained the property of the state, and they could not be buried by their families. The state buried them in pauper graves in cemeteries around Mamelodi and so on. And the families never knew all these years, or took them many years to try and establish where their loved ones had been buried. So our project was to try to locate those graves and to recover the remains of those so that they can be buried by their families.
And given to their families. Well, let's talk through the 7 that were exhumed today, the Mansfield 4 and the Ponderland 3. They're obviously distinct groups not involved in the same activities.
Yeah. So the PAC group were Pork Claw members who were... This
is now the Mansfield 4.
The Mansfield 4, yeah. They were from Krugersdorp, and they were, in a sense, responding to the call by PAC leadership for a sort of nationwide uprising against the apartheid system and particularly the oppression that was instituted in the early 1960s. And what we understand from the trial records is that the local PAC branch took a decision to take action against a local security policeman. I think his name was Johannes Makwena, who was monitoring the activities of the PAC.
So he would have been seen as a collaborator with the system.
Yes, yeah. He was employed as a security policeman. And so he was in fact shot in 1963 while walking in the street of Mansfield. And then these 4 particular PAC members were arrested. They were charged with murder. I think most of them pleaded not guilty, as I recall. But they were ultimately sentenced to death and they were executed.
Now, the Ponderland 3 were for a separate incident involving a local headman. I thought it was interesting to note that they were defended by no less than a young Albie Sachs.
Yes, yeah. So this, they weren't actually from Ponderland, but we refer to them as the Ponderland group because the incident sort of flows out of the wider popular Ponderland revolt, which took place during the 1960s, early 1960s, where local communities basically rose up against the imposition of government imposed chiefs and local headmen. And what happened in this instance was that there was a very unpopular local headman, and the community had pleaded, I think they'd sent at least 5 delegations to the local magistrate to have him removed. He was predating on people's wives, seizing cattle, imposing taxes and so on, to no avail. And ultimately, it was a kind of a village attack. It was a group attack. He was killed by a large group of people. And I think it was 35 people were arrested. And ultimately, of that group, 20 were convicted of murder and sentenced to prison terms. And 3 were sentenced to death, including 2 brothers, Katiana and Mpitizeli Zoya, were 2 of the 3 sentenced to death. And they were, yes, as you say, they were Albie Sachs was part of the defense team that defended them. I've heard that they were fearing that up to 12 people were going to be sentenced to death, but I think the efforts of the defense team managed to reduce it to 3. It was, I think he did it pro bono, Albie Sachs did. Yeah.
Madeleine, in a sense, this ties up, you could say, the loose ends of the TRC process as part of the unfinished business from that process, is it not?
Yes, that is exactly the work of our team. It was the Truth Commission, the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that made a recommendation that government must set up a task team to continue tracing those who disappeared and to try to recover their remains, and that is precisely the work of our team. We are made up partly of investigators and partly forensic anthropologists who specialize in the human skeleton, because of course many decades ago, any remains we are talking about are skeleton.
I mean, I suppose it raises the question, how many others are lying in unmarked graves, forgotten, their stories untold, their contributions not remembered?
Yes, well, certainly on the Gallows Project, we intend to certainly recover all of the political prisoners, and there were 131 political prisoners executed between 1960 and 1990 when the death penalty was suspended. And they come from PAC, ANC, and UDF, United Democratic Front, in the 1980s. And we are approximately halfway through the project at the moment. We've made good progress, and we are confident we'll recover all of their remains. But beyond the Gallows Project, we have many, many more, hundreds of cases.
There were many people who just disappeared.
Yes,
and nobody ever heard from them again. There was no explanation. And to this day, many families are left with unanswered questions.
We have, in addition to the Gallows cases, we have recovered the remains of about 146 persons. But each one is a complicated investigation, a search, and we depend a lot on information from the public. And
that's my next question. I mean, can people still come forward if people still have unanswered questions about a loved one who might have disappeared, if they've got any details? Would it be helpful for them to approach you with those?
Yes, it certainly is. We work on political cases of disappearance. But families continue to approach us. They certainly do,
What about the records? I mean, from our understanding, as you've said, these are largely unmarked graves. How then do you begin to know which bodies belong to which person? Take us through that process of your investigation.
Well, with the Gallows Project, there actually are fairly decent records. The prisons, as they were, the Department of Prisons, as it was then, did keep records of the grave numbers to some extent, not perfectly, and then also the cemeteries themselves have got record books, and the names do appear with the grave numbers. But we also do our own process of verification, so even after the exhumation we do a forensic examination of the remains to check that the biological profile is essentially consistent with the person that we are looking for. So we do follow up the records with a forensic examination.
I'm just looking at the visuals on a big screen here of the ceremony today. How moving is it for so many of these families who, I mean, from the package we played earlier, some of them saying that they were 3 years old when a father disappeared, never knowing who they were, never knowing where they ended up. How moving was today?
There were a lot of tears. The family started by going through the gallows, the very place where they were hanged. And the gallows is really a harrowing experience to walk through that. I've been through many times, and I'm devastated every single time.
There's a sense of their spirits echoing in those lonely
and
halls.
You stand in that room, and not only the political prisoners, but anybody who was executed there. There were over 5,000 people killed in that room. It's devastating.
Were family members ever allowed to witness those moments?
Not the executions, no. They were allowed to visit the condemned the day before, and after the hangings they were permitted to attend a short sort of prayer service with the coffin closed. They were not allowed to open the coffin, and from there the coffin was taken away and buried by the state. They never saw it again.
Until this process that we saw today.
So there certainly were a lot of tears, but also smiles in a way, because it's also a kind of a joyful process that at the end of the day, after so many decades, at last they will be able to bury their family member and have some insight into what his last days were and where he's been lying all these years. So that means a lot. We'll
have to leave it there. Madeleine Fullard, thank you very much for coming in, and congratulations on the great work that you are doing. Madeleine Fullard, who's of course the leader of the Gallows Exhumation Project.